Hi guys, welcome back. Today I'm talking about 3 autobiographies that I read recently that were an emotional roller coaster. They'll make you laugh, they'll make you cry, and they'll make you feel every single emotion in between. I want to start by saying that if you're interested in any of the books that I mentioned today, they'll all be linked in the description box below. And so without wasting any more time, let's get started. The first book I want to talk about today is called Life is So Good by George Dawson and Richard Glaubman. This book is just, I think emotional is the right word. The book is basically about George's life, and he was a black man that lived in the United States throughout the entire 20th century, the 1900s. So he was actually born in 1898 and then passed away, I believe, in 2001. So he lived to be 103 years old. And the book is basically just a recount of his life and his experiences for the last 103 years. It starts off by talking about the situation that he was born in the United States in the late 1800s to early 1900s, where, as I'm sure most of you know, black people definitely weren't as accepted into society as they are these days. And it was quite a scary and particularly dangerous time for black Americans living particularly in the South of America as well during that time. George talks about quite a few times where he witnesses black people being very unfairly treated, to say the least, particularly during his childhood. And he also talks about how that really sort of shaped his outlook on life. And despite what you may assume, which is what I originally assumed, that it would be a very negative outlook on life, he really just took everything in his stride and ended up being one of the most positive people that I think I've ever known about. George lives in relative poverty with his family, and from a very young age he's put to work on the farm and helping the family out, and he's also sent away to work to earn money for the family as well. So from a very early age he basically just becomes a labourer. He never gets an opportunity to go to school, and quite incredibly he doesn't actually learn to read until he's 98 years old, when all of a sudden he gets an opportunity to go to an adults literacy class and just absolutely grabs onto the opportunity, because for 98 years he wasn't able to even write his own name. George's outlook on life and his attitude towards life, despite all the difficulties that he went through during his childhood and even well into his adulthood, is just the most inspiring story to ever have the pleasure of reading. This book is just absolutely fantastic, and it might be a bit more heavy at the beginning of the book when George is talking about the less nice things about the society that he was born into, but just by the end you can't help but feel just, what's the word, not even more than positive, just it just really reframes at least my whole life. It reframed my whole life, and I kind of feel like if George can go through the life that he had and have such a positive outlook by the end of it and take every opportunity that he gets and grabs onto it, I just feel like there's nothing that I can't handle or can't have a positive attitude about as well in my life. So truly inspiring, emotional at times, but just really amazing book. This one is an absolute must read. The next book is Uncultured by Daniela Mestyanek Young. This book is definitely emotional and really quite heavy at times. This book is about Daniela's story and her life up until this point. She talks a lot about being born into the Children of God cult, which was, I think still is actually, a religious cult that's in America, but I believe also in other parts of the world. It is really heavy, actually, the beginning of the book. She talks a lot about all the abuse that goes on inside the cult, sexual, emotional, physical. It's really quite an intense story and just a really heartbreaking childhood as well. And Daniela talks a lot about how she really just wants to be with her parents for most of her childhood, but the way the cult is structured, she's taken away from them a lot and really encouraged to just be part of the family instead of with her actual biological family. Her childhood is so distressing at points that I actually almost stopped reading the book, but I told myself that I wanted to just get through it because I felt like Daniela's story was really important to know, and I'm so glad that I persevered because this book ended up being absolutely incredible to read. After talking a lot about her childhood, Daniela ends up leaving the cult at age 15, and I think it's a real testament to how strong-willed she is that she ended up leaving the cult, particularly because she was born into the cult, so she would have not really known, well, she didn't really know any other life. She didn't know what was outside the cult, and she was always told that everything outside was dangerous and scary and that the best place for her and the safest place for her was inside the family, which is absolutely untrue. In fact, the most dangerous place for her really was inside the family or the cult. But I think it's just amazing that Daniela, not having any experience of the outside world, still felt strongly enough that she had to leave the abusive situation that she was in. And it took a lot of courage, I think, to do that. And it's just amazing to hear about her story and to read it. And so at the age of 15, she left the cult and ended up enrolling in the United States Army. And she was eventually deployed to Afghanistan, where she served at least a year. I think she went back twice actually to Afghanistan, if I remember correctly from the book. So she fought a lot in Afghanistan. She drew a lot of similarities between the abusive and manipulative nature of the cult that she grew up in, and also sometimes the abusive and manipulative nature of the army as well, and how women really weren't perceived to be equal to men within the army, and how she left one situation where she was not treated equally, to say the least, and how she ended up finding herself in not the same situation, but there were definitely similarities between how she was treated in the cult and how she was treated while serving in the army. I found it really, really interesting to see the similarities between the two situations. And I found it really interesting to see how she coped with basically finding herself in another controlling environment, essentially. Daniela is a survivor, to say the least. It's just absolutely incredible what she went through. It's absolutely incredible what she was able to survive, and reading her story was an absolute honor, and I'm so glad that I did. The last book I'm going to talk about today is called The Coffin Confessor by Bill Edgar, and I want to start by mentioning that I mentioned this book in my TBR video from a few weeks ago, and I think I actually said Bill's name incorrectly, so sorry about that. The author of The Coffin Confessor is called Bill Edgar. Bill's story was absolutely incredible. I was not expecting this book to be about what it ended up being about. The book is mainly about Bill's job as a coffin confessor. So basically his clients are people that are about to pass away, and they ask him to do things either at their funeral once they have passed away, like for example stand up and say some information or tell the crowd something that they didn't know about the person who's passed, or to do other things like clean out their house if they have some questionable objects that they don't want their family to see. A whole range of different jobs that Bill is happy to take on as, I guess, almost like a dying wish or a dying request from his clients. That part of the story alone is really interesting. I didn't even know that that kind of service would have any demand, but I guess it makes sense that it does. And I'm really glad that Bill kind of found that job. I think it suits him really well. And the reason why I say that is because Bill had quite a traumatic childhood and lived his teenage years either on the street or in prison. He goes into quite a lot of detail about what happened in his childhood and the situation that he was brought up in, and it is quite heavy at times and very emotional at times too. It was really interesting to see how the trauma that he endured during his childhood then translated into him being homeless and breaking the law often during his teenage and young adulthood years. Bill ended up in prison for a few years as well, and he talks about his experience behind bars, and I found that really interesting as well, just to hear his first-hand account of experiencing life in jail. I was really glad to read that after jail Bill decided to clean up his life a bit and to get a job and to really try and make something of his life. Considering what he went through in his younger years, I feel like it would have been very easy for him to just go back on the streets, but instead he chose to make something more of himself, and it was really heartwarming to see that. Even though it wasn't an easy transition, it was wonderful that he made that choice for himself. But I think the rough nature of his childhood definitely gave him almost the confidence in a way to stand up and basically gate crash people's funerals and tell their family information that the family may not want to hear. I can really see the transition from, a really rough adolescence and childhood to doing that kind of coffin confessing job. Bill's life is truly unique and extraordinary, and it was absolutely emotional for a lot of it, but it was a wonderful story to read. And I really truly wasn't expecting his story to be what it was. It was just wonderful to read. My only critique for this book was that about 75 to 80% of it was Bill's life story and all about his childhood and his adolescence and everything like that. And I would have liked to read a bit more about his clients and his job as a coffin confessor. He does talk about his coffin confessing work enough that you get a good understanding and a good feel for what he does, but most of the story was his life story, and I definitely didn't want to learn less about his life story because I found that extremely interesting, but I wish he had included just a bit more about his job as well. Maybe the book would have ended up being a bit longer in that case, but that's okay, because it was so wonderful to read anyway that I wanted it to keep going. Those are the 3 autobiographies that I read recently that were a roller coaster, emotional, heavy, amazing, inspiring, and all of the above. I hope you get a chance to read these books, and if you do, please let me know what you think in the comments below. As mentioned earlier, all these books will also be linked in the description box. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye.